Здравствуйте, все. Welcome everybody to Odessa, Ukraine. We're doing our What's Going On in Ukraine episode today. Got a lot to learn, a lot to talk about from this crazy post-Soviet country. Let's get it. Odessa, Odessa, Odessa. One of my new favorite cities in Europe. I've spent almost 3 weeks here and it's been an absolute blast. It's a beautiful port city on the Black Sea with delightful people, decent food, really good vibes, and beautiful, beautiful churches, architecture, and post-Soviet stuff. Got a lot to talk about in today's episode, so let's get into the story of this Eastern European country. So people have been living in this part of Europe for about 32,000 years. Long time. But the story of modern Ukraine, or of the Ukrainian identity, the Ukrainian people, goes back to the Kievan Rus Empire, which was kind of, you can think of it as these OG Slavic people, the original Ukrainians and Russians, the Slavic inhabitants of this part of Europe. Before there was a Moscow, before there was a Russia, there was the Kievan Rus. And these people essentially came from the Vikings. They used to speak a semi-intelligible language to the Nordic languages, and there are some identifying factors that the original Russian Slavic languages actually are akin a little bit to the ancient Nordic languages of the Scandinavian region. It's crazy. While the Kievan Rus kind of set the stage for the modern Ukrainian identity, they didn't last very long, and they were essentially taken over by the Mongols, and then the Ukrainian state, the Slavic states, the Slavic people were fractured after the devastation that the Mongols had. After the Mongols did their business, Ukraine was fractured between various empires over various times in history. They were part of the Lithuanian-Polish alliance, they were part of the Russian Empire, they were part of the Ottoman Empire, they were part of the Tatar, Cossack, Hetmanate. And that kind of diversity in identity is still felt here in Ukraine, and it's why the east of Ukraine, the north of Ukraine, the south of Ukraine have very different stories. The cities look very different, but they all come together under the banner of modern day Ukraine. This is certainly one of the factors in why Ukrainian food is so diverse, why Ukrainian language has so many hints of so many other languages in it, and why the Ukrainian people do not look homogenous as what I saw in Russia, especially when you go to the, to Moscow, to St. Petersburg. A lot of the people look very similar, but here in Ukraine, people have dark features, people have light features, people have red hair, people have darker skin. And the reason for that is there's been so many different people through this land, and this land has been part of so many different empires. So while of course this was a Soviet republic, and that's what we kind of think of it as, the story is a little bit more complicated than that. Whenever you're in a Soviet republic, they always built these underground passageways. Doesn't matter if you're in Kyiv, if you're in Riga, if you're in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, you're going to find people underground doing underground things and selling underground goods. My favorite part are probably these very steep, very sketchy ramps that they built for people in wheelchairs, because I don't know how you're supposed to get somebody down this, but sometimes these are incredibly treacherous, and I feel really bad for anybody who's in a wheelchair that needs to use that. So today in this episode, I don't want to focus too much on the history. If you're interested in the history, there's lots of cool resources online. You can learn about the Kievan Rus Empire and all of these various empires. But if you go to, for example, Odessa, and then you go to Kyiv, and you go to Lviv, you go to Kharkiv, the 4 major cities of Ukraine, you visit each one, they all feel very different. Because Lviv was part of Germanic empires. Odessa was part of the Bessarabian area, and it has this kind of very different feel, more akin to Moldova and to Russia. And Kyiv is very much its own place with its own particular Art Deco style, its own vibe, and its own kind of modern influences, very different than what you would find in Moscow or St. Petersburg. If you go to Kharkiv, the biggest city in the east, you can find it. Здравствуйте, брат. Привет. Давай фото. If you go to Kharkiv, the biggest city in the eastern part of Ukraine, you notice that because it was a newer city built during the Soviet times, the city center is incredibly Soviet, with large block housing buildings and this very kind of imperialist Soviet style that was being built. The cool part about Ukraine is they have so many cities that were built during different parts of history. So you can see all these different styles and the transitions and the kind of cities that these people built over time. So you can find new cities on older cities, with old castles, with new kind of modern housing, with old Soviet block housing. It's very, very complicated here. Because Ukraine is in the news so much, what I want to focus on today is modern Ukraine, the Ukraine national identity that has been built after 1990, when the Soviet Union fell. When people think of Ukraine today, they really define it on the fact that it was a Soviet Socialist Republic from the 1920s. There has always been this Ukrainian national identity that has been at the bottom of this country, kind of as something to hold it together since the Kiev and Rus Empire, of course. But that being said, the Ukrainian identity didn't really get to show itself until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, where Ukraine broke off, declared its own republic, and became its own autonomous country. So after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990, things in Ukraine moved really fast and were absolutely chaotic for a long period of time, which extends to today. The first thing that you need to know is that as the power vacuum of the Soviet Union left, Ukraine became the second largest country in Europe, with a population now today of about 45 million. Ukraine also was home to some of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, and so it became one of the new world's most, let's say, armed populaces with access to these nuclear weapons. Now, in a treaty signed with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine actually gave up all of their nuclear weapons and demilitarized themselves in a very, very strange kind of political move. While they were demilitarizing themselves, giving up their nuclear weapons and becoming de-armed, oligarchs popped up. And this was a crazy time period because essentially, at least the stories go, that Ukraine had so much ex-Soviet military equipment, billions and billions of dollars of it. These people who kind of had the fast track, maybe military leaders, maybe insider politicians, knew where these stockpiles were located. They basically put them on the market, on the black market, and they sold them to the highest bidder. So Ukraine in the 90s had billions and billions of dollars of basically illegal black market arms flowing out of Ukraine into the Middle East, maybe went to the United States, went to various countries through kind of sketchy contracts. And the kind of fact that this country was a no man's land for, let's say, political systems in the 1990s led to these oligarchs taking a lot of power in Ukraine. And the same way that it is in Russia, where you have maybe 1% of the population owning all of the serious wealth, building palaces. They own oil and gas, they own steel, they own all of these various resources. And it was essentially stolen. There's not a lot of legitimate companies that came out of the early 90s in Ukraine. It was just these insiders who were part of the, let's say, Soviet sphere of influence, and then knew how and when to take these resources. Now, I know that's a big statement, and I know it might get me in trouble on YouTube, but it is what it is. And that's the reality that most Ukrainians live in today. With a lot of the money consolidating at the top and a lot of the resources consolidating with just a few people, the Ukrainian people, unfortunately, developed a very corrupt society. So you can see here, we're on the main drag of Odessa. You know, it's a nice modern city. They've got beautiful buildings. They've got, you know, nice park benches. They've got everything that you could want in a nice European capital, right? Well, not a capital, but a city worth visiting. But the fact of the matter is that the majority of cities do not look like this in Ukraine. A lot of people come from small villages that don't have access to a lot of resources. The average salary is maybe $200, $300 per month. And the other cities that were built during the Soviet times, the larger cities, this is still the same situation. Most people here in Odessa, of course, don't live in the city center. The cost of living in Kyiv and in Odessa and in the city centers of these large Ukrainian cities is actually quite high. And the reason is, what my friend explained to me, is that there is essentially no middle class in Ukraine. There are the people who are making $300, $400, $500 a month, and then there are the people making $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 per month. And if you're making, you know, upwards of 4 times, 5 times, 6 times the average salary of, you know, the average Ukrainian, you actually lump yourself into the like, let's say top 5% of earners here. So if you're looking to live in the city center, you're competing with people who are actually making a like reasonable international salary. Whereas in other, let's say, European cities, you have probably more access because most people make a similar salary. The problem is that the lower proportion of the population, salary-wise, is actually a huge, you know, swath of the population, maybe like, I don't know, like 80% of the people. I mean, it's wild. So that brings me to our first question: is Ukraine cheap? Well, depends, I guess, who you are. If you're coming here as a foreigner, Ukraine is pretty cheap. I mean, you can eat for maybe $6 or $7. You can buy beers for $6 or $7. You know, have a proper night out is what I mean. Because let's say the expensive restaurants, they only cater to people who actually make good salaries. So if you're in kind of the suburbs or something, it's really incredibly cheap because most people aren't making that much money. But if you're in the city center here, these places are not the cheapest. These can be on par with other cities in, let's say, Central or Western Europe even. In a city like Odessa, that's a big tourist place for the Russian world, and for Central Europeans, the city's even more expensive because you have all of the people traveling from other parts of the world to come here. I noticed there's lots of Arabs here, lots of Indians visit here, a lot of Turks, and then of course a lot of Russian tourists. The second question, and the most important question for Ukraine, is it safe? And this is a longer, very complex story, which deals with the Ukrainian civil war that happened in 2014, the revolution, the Russian occupation, the annexation of Crimea, and all those good things. So we're going to get into that. So I'm here in Odessa, which is the south and the west. Kyiv is in the center, Lviv is in the west, super west, and in the east you have all of the problem areas that I was just explaining. So in 2013, 14, Ukraine had a bit of a civil war and had a revolution. They had a very corrupt president, and not to get into too much detail, because if you're interested in that, I'm sure you can find a Ukrainian person to tell you. The country kind of fell into shambles. And 2 parts of eastern Ukraine, and these 2 regions called the Donbass, which includes the cities of Lugansk and Donetsk, broke off in a military fashion. During this time, the Ukrainian military began to wage a war against separatists in these regions. And at the same time, the Crimean Peninsula was essentially annexed by the Russians. Now, the Russians say that they had nothing to do necessarily with the war in Luhansk and Donetsk, which of course borders Russia, but it's clearly not true. There's been a lot of evidence that they were supporting these separatists who were trying to establish a state called Novorossiya, New Russia. And now, even, let's say 7 years removed from that, the region over there is still, it's still a war. It's still a war zone. People are still dealing with fighting. People are still dealing with shelling. People's houses have been destroyed, and it's a really horrible situation. Now, of course, if you're a Ukrainian with any sort of nationalist sensibilities, the annexation of Crimea is incredibly troubling. The fact that the Donbass is now a war zone is incredibly troubling. But it doesn't mean that Ukraine is a dangerous country. The majority of Ukraine is completely normal. There's no war here. There's no necessarily military problems that you can find anywhere in these cities. And you know, in any country, you just want to be aware of your surroundings, but the majority of Ukraine is no more dangerous than Berlin or Paris or London. In Kyiv, I went to the Ukrainian National War History Museum, and on the top they had an entire kind of display made to the ongoing war in the east with Donetsk, Luhansk, and the Russian separatists. And it's a point of national pride that the government really wants to bolster. So if you go to any Ukrainian city, you'll see, let's say, you know, you'll see memorials, you'll see a lot of flags, you'll see a lot of, let's say, national markers. Not so much here in Odessa, but I noticed it was very, very prevalent in Kyiv. They had the national symbol everywhere. They had flags everywhere. And in Ukraine, because they're trying to now distance themselves from Russia, because they really, you know, they don't like them these days. The west of Ukraine is becoming Ukrainized, or whatever you want to say. So They're teaching Ukrainian in schools. Ukrainian is now the first national language, and they are actually putting laws into the books which requires the Ukrainian language to be used on all official documentation in restaurants and in other, let's say, other shops, even if the people are interacting in Russian. They have to do it first in Ukrainian. So I think the weird part, at least for me, is that, you know, when most people think of Ukraine, when they think of its national identity, they lump it in a lot with Russia, but these two countries couldn't be more at odds, and instead of being brothers as they really probably should be because of the history, the shared culture, the shared value system, they are actually the biggest enemies in the region. That also connects to NATO, of course, with Europe being very interested in the future of Ukraine, because it's, of course, the second largest country in Europe after Russia, and it has a large border on the proximity of Russia. But of course, this is Russian kind of, let's say hegemonic territory, and Russia still very much wants to be in control of what's happening here in Ukraine today, even though the Ukrainians themselves do not want it and do not feel any connection to these people anymore. You can think of it as like a little brother, big brother spat, but with much more, you know, life and death consequences, if you want to put it that way. But if you look around and you're walking around Ukraine, you can see a lot of similar sights to what you might find in Russia, of course. And if I plopped you here and you didn't really know, you know, so much national context or national differences, you'd probably just assume you were in Russia because they use the Cyrillic alphabet, they have Ladas, they have the Soviet buildings, they have these kind of very epic imperial buildings from the Russian Empire times, which makes it all the more confusing and delightful. But what you can see here, what I want to show you, this is the Ukrainian national symbol. It's a trident, and it goes back to the Kievan Rus, and they have these on every sort of, like, let's say, important government building. And so this is the faculty of pharmacy, the faculty of pharmacy, and it's a beautiful old building. So what about the cities here, and something a little more positive? I really like Ukraine. I think the vibe is awesome. They have really good restaurants, they have a really cool bar scene. The people in this country are incredibly cool and very chill. A lot of the younger people, they speak English not incredibly well, but the thing is, you have to think most of the people here speak two languages because they have to speak Ukrainian and Russian, and probably they're going to speak English too, especially if you're in Kyiv. Some things to know about traveling in Ukraine are that the distances in the city are huge, or the distances in this country. They have a train. It's kind of like the old Soviet type of train that takes you from the south to the north to the east to the west, but it does take a while. They have the sleeper trains. They have buses, but the roads in this country are pretty bad, and the connectivity, especially with the east, the closer you get to the kind of like region that's having a little bit more issues, is not great. What I love the most about Ukraine is the architecture, actually. I think especially these older cities, Odessa, Kyiv, Lviv, have some of the coolest architecture out of any city that I've seen in Eastern Europe, and they have these beautiful, gorgeous buildings, and they take care of some of them. Some of them are fading into the abyss, and they have this cool little beach-themed Eastern European situation and these really grand boulevards. It really makes it nice to walk around. They took a lot of time to make sure that everything was made correctly, and it seems that the work that was done during the Russian Empire here is still kind of celebrated. Like, even if we come over here, this must be some sort of music school or something, because they have the harp, the notes, look at that. And then that's cool is they also have the old sign, so Shipkina Street. That's sort of final note on this video. I think I've found my summer European country of choice. I feel like Ukraine has everything you could want. It's pretty fair priced. The people are really cool. There's lots of opportunities to meet people, to speak English. The women are just beautiful here. That's also a big plus. Everything else seems to kind of work well. And it has that kind of weird Asian kind of like old school vibe that you can't really find in Western Europe. So for me, this place is incredibly comfortable, and I'm so happy that I came here. And it might be a tough one. After Georgia, it might be my favorite country in Eastern Europe ranked. Because look at that, guys. Look at that. Look at that. Beautiful. You can scooter around. Look at that. Gorgeous, gorgeous. And to end the video, of course, since we're in Odessa, the port city, I cannot finish any proper video about this beautiful city without taking you down to this square, making a left, and taking you to the Potemkin Stairs, the famous viewing point of the Black Sea for so many Soviets, Kievan Rus, Ottomans, and modern day Ukrainians. And here we made it to the Potemkin Stairs. So over here you have an funicular. Not sure how old it is, but a funicular, you know, takes you down and up because these stairs are pretty steep. And just over here, you're gonna get a pretty epic view of the Black Sea. And theoretically, if you were to look south, you could see the north coast of Turkey if you had laser vision and could see thousands and thousands of kilometers. In modern Odessa today, you've got a hotel, you got a little boardwalk situation. Over here is the port of Odessa. It kind of ruins the whole vibe of this area because you're looking right onto a port, but it's active and you can see it's kind of cool. And then if you go this way, there's a lot of cool restaurants and bars. Odessa is known as kind of the party location in like Ukraine for the summer, so a lot of people come here. They you know, they come here, they drink. There's a bunch of bars and restaurants down that way, and it's overall pretty damn nice with the funicular. So that's gonna be it for this episode, guys. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe. If you didn't like it, don't subscribe. That's your choice. And we're heading to Greece after this, so stay tuned for some Greek adventures. That we're done with Eastern Europe. The season's over, it's getting cold, and I need the sun. So we will catch you in Greece. Stay tuned, let's get Greek. Das Vidania one last time from Odessa, Ukraine.